There's been lots of debate about social media in the general blogosphere or Substackosphere, since that's kind of replaced the blogosphere. I want to go into this because it overlaps with my ideas about decadence, but also cuts against it. This is a piece from January of 2025 by Henry Farrell, called "We're Getting the Social Media Crisis Wrong. The bigger problem isn't disinformation, it's degraded democratic publics." Let's see where this goes. This post lays out some ideas I've been thinking about for a long while. You should treat my claims with appropriate skepticism. I am saying that a lot of the public thinking and academic research about social media is chasing after the wrong target on the basis of A, my idiosyncratic reading of social theory, which is actually usually what people are doing, and B, my partial understanding of current events. But my approach provides a superficially coherent account of how the relationship between social media and democracy is changing in the US and other countries. Cool. Over the last few weeks, we've seen Elon Musk transforming X/Twitter to a kind of deranged parallel universe out of a Philip K. Dick novel, in which political realities of the US, UK, and Germany are rearranging themselves around the obsession of an unelected individual. Now, Mark Zuckerberg seems to be taking the guardrails off of Meta's social media service, which was only put up fairly recently. I mean, I find this interesting that people forget that like we existed in a world where this was where there was not algorithmic censorship for good and ill for most of the history of Facebook and Meta services. There's a lot of focusing on hate speech and disinformation, but the problem is you need social consensus around those things to really enforce them, and there really isn't social consensus around them. My explanation of what is happening is this. We tend to think of the problem of social media as a problem of disinformation. Oh, I don't, actually. That is, of people receiving erroneous information and being convinced that false things are in fact true. However, we can try to make social media better through fact-checking, through educating people to see falsehoods and similar. I never thought that. And in fact, the problem is there's a tendency to expand fact-checking from facticity to framework checking, and framework checking is ideological. All right. This is indeed a problem, but not the most important one. We existed with disinformation on cable for like half a century and no one complained about it. I mean, people complained about it, but it wasn't like it's going to end democracy. You know, it was more like it's generally dumbing down the public. That was the idea in the past. The pitch view that discourses themselves undermine democracy is an old discourse, but also a new one. And when I say, you know, that seemingly contradictory statement, there's been talks about, you know, people's biases and whatnot being a undermining factor in democratic republics for a long time. But the particular focus on specific disinformation removal, not just counter information, but outright disinformation removal, was really a thing that we started seeing bubbling up after 2016. And I hate to tell people, but it doesn't really work. It's not like, for example, stopping anti-trans speech on Facebook or Instagram stopped anti-trans sentiments or even anti-trans legislation. All right. The fundamental problem, as I see it, is not that social media misinforms individuals about what is true or false, but it creates publics with malformed collective understanding. Well, publics almost always have malformed collective understanding. This is a more subtle problem, but it's also a more pernicious one. Explaining it may require some words. Bear with me. Well, I'm going to bear with you because I'm going to see if this is something that I agree with, that there's a general degradation of social life, and so social media is the symptom, not the cause of. But this also might be dangerously close to the liberal, well, let's throw out the electorate and get a better one because they don't agree with our moral values argument. All right. The fundamental problem is this. We tend to think about democracy as a phenomenon that depends on the knowledge and capabilities of individual citizens, even though, like markets and bureaucracies, it's a profoundly collective enterprise. That's actually a true statement. We tend to think of this about individual education. Individual education is beyond the point. And in fact, if you think about your social milieu and your relation to it as an extension of your own cognitive capacities, because in some ways it is, other people help you think and refine your thinking, even in the acquisition of language, terms, and ideas for which you can frame your thinking into. Thinking is a social product for mammals like us. Focusing on individual relationships to misinformation seems like a very dumb way to go about it. I mean, it respects the individual as an agent, but also like leads to this very weird and almost censorious way of trying to handle the problem. That in turn leads us to focus on how social media shapes individual knowledge for better or worse and mistakes symptoms for the cause. I actually agree with that. A lot of argument about democracy, both in public and among the academics who inquire into it, make heroic claims about the wisdom and intelligence of individual citizens. We want citizens who are wise, well-informed, and thinking to think about the collective good. Sometimes we believe that citizens are all these things. The problem is that the actual individual citizens are biased and, on average, not particularly knowledgeable about politics. That's always a problem. But knowledge about politics doesn't actually even correlate to better policy making in study after study. So, not sure that you're actually getting to what I'm getting at. But here, Henry, we'll see though. This mismatch between rhetoric and reality has created opportunities for minor academic industry of librarians and conservatives arguing that democracy is of libertarians and conservatives arguing that democracy is unworkable and that we should rely instead on well-informed elites to rule. The problem is that this elitist case against democracy is that the elites are just as biased and furthermore liable to use their greater knowledge to bolster their biases rather than correct them. For an extended version of this repose, see this essay by Hugo Mercier, Melissa Swassbart, and myself. The problem of human bias goes all the way down. Yeah, elite opinion and expertise does not actually transcend bias. In fact, as I talked about in a piece by Musa Al-Gharbi, intelligence actually compounds bias because you're better at defending your biases. All right. So what can we do to ameliorate the problem? Making individuals better at thinking and seeing the blind spots in their own individual reasoning may only go so far. What we need is a better collective means of thinking. As Hugo, Melissa, and I argue here, academic article, but I think it's fairly reasonable, much of the work on human cognitive bias suggests that people actually think much better collectively than individually, offering prospects for a different understanding of democracy. I think that's important, in which my pig-headed advocacy for a particular flawed perspective allows me to see the flaws in your pig-headed argument and point them out with gusto and vice versa for the general improvement of our thought. We think socially, both dialectically and dialogically. Dialectically, it was opposition between ideas and also development in history. Dialogically is the ideas of the people have implanted in us, sometimes implicitly, even in the words we use. This is a particular version of the argument that was made more generally by Herbert Simon. There are sharp limits to individual cognition, and we have invented collective means to think better together. Brad DeLong has a nice phrase for the specific advantage of the human species, analogy intelligence, which captures this. Markets, bureaucracies, and indeed democracy can all serve as collective means of problem solving and compensation for individual deficits under the right circumstances. I tend to think markets and bureaucracies are problematic, but yeah. But the qualifying phrase is under the right circumstances is key. All of these institutional forms have failure modes. One can see the ghost of Polybius coming up. To understand this particular success and failures of modes of democracy, it is better not to focus on individual citizens, but on democratic publics. Democracy is supposed to be a system in which political decisions are not taken by kings or dictators, but by the public or by representative agents that are responsible to the public and can be removed through election or similar. In principle, then, the public is aggregated beliefs and wants of the citizenry as a whole. The problem is that we have no way to directly see what all the citizens want and believe, or to make full sense of it. So instead, we rely on a variety of representative technologies to make the public visible in more or less imperfect ways. Voting is one such technology. Different voting systems tend to lead to quite different manifestations of the public. Oh, this is the first past the post stuff. First past the post system of the US and the United Kingdom tend to produce publics in which political contention is channeled through competition between two opposing parties, as opposed to many smaller parties. Yeah, the thing is, though, even in the countries that have a lot more smaller parties, they still basically break down into two camps. Opinion polls are another. They now seem quite natural to us as a gauge of public opinion, but as Andy Perrin and Catherine McFarlane argue, they seem strange and unnatural when they were first introduced. And I don't think they actually work. This is what they actually say. I don't think opinion polls actually... I mean, they're the best thing we have for understanding mass opinion, but they're also not very good. More importantly, all these systems are not just passive measurements of public opinion, but active forces that rework it. Yep. How you frame those questions really matters. As Perrin and McFarlane say, publics are evoked, even shaped, by the techniques that represent them. Human beings are coalitional animals. We appear to have specialized subsystems in our brain for understanding what the group politics are in a given situation, who as opposed to who, and what the opportunities are. In Perrin and McFarlane's example, when Republicans said in polls that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim, they did not believe this claim in the same way that they believed that water was wet. Instead, their claim had some of the qualities of what Hugo and Dan Sperber call a reflective belief, and some of the qualities of a shibboleth, something that you are supposed to believe and publicly affirm that you believe, but might or might not actually subscribe to personally. Yeah, it's one of those, we believe it because it's irrational, and that irrationality proves that we are committed to the group kinds of beliefs. There's a lot of those in life. In short, the technologies run through which we see the public shape what we think the public is. And that, in turn, shapes how we behave politically and how we orient ourselves. This is a mutually constitutive fights and whatnot that we see in public life through negative partisanship, etc. We may end up believing in highly specific ways in things we know we're supposed to believe, given that we are Republicans or Democrats, conservative or Labor Party members, or Marxist versus anarchists, etc. We may end up not believing these things, but also declining to express our actual beliefs publicly because we're not supposed to believe whatever we privately think. This is a public-private doublethink phenomenon. It's more universal than people realize. The coalitions that we create, the political battles that we imagine ourselves as engaging in, it may also depend on the technologies and particular fights and issues they highlight. This can, under the right circumstances, be roughly to the good. Coalitional politics and disputes are inevitably messy and contentious, but they can be turned around towards useful ends. When there are moderate political incentives towards error correction, people feel some obligation to revise their most stupid views in response to well-aimed criticism. Small end pig-headed contention can scale up into forms of competition in which different parties battle it out to provide some rough version of the public good. This has its own problems, but given the way in which human brains work, it is probably as good as we can reasonably hope to get. This is why I'm sort of like a hopeful pessimist. It can also turn bad when pig-headedness feeds into itself and becomes self-reinforcing. Bringing this all together, the with which we see the public shape how we understand it, making it more likely we end up in one of the situations rather than the other. And as you've surely guessed by now, I believe that X, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media services are just technologies for shaping publics. Many of the problems we are going to face over the next many years will stem from publics that have been deranged and distorted by social medias in ways that lower the odds that democracy will be a problem-solving system and increase the likelihood that it will be a problem-creating one. I mean, it's always both all the time, friend. The example that really makes me think about how this works has nothing to do with democracy or political theory. It has to do with an article published in the Logic magazine in 2019 about internet porn. The article's argument is that the presentation of porn and that people's sense of what other people's sexual interests are is shaped by the algorithm that responds to sharp differences between what people see and what people are willing to pay for. The key claim, quote, a lot of people are consumers of internet porn, i.e., they watch it but don't pay for it. A tiny fraction of those people are customers. Customers pay for porn typically by clicking an ad on a tube site, going to specific content owned by MindGeek, and entering their credit card information. This consumer versus customer division is the key to understanding the use of data to perpetuate categories that seem particular to many people, both inside and outside the industry. Porn companies, when trying to figure out what people want, focus on the customers who convert. It's their taste to set the tone for the professionally produced content and the industry as a whole. The buyers have downstream effects, basically. The result is that particular taboos, incest, choking, feature heavily in the presentation of internet porn, not because they are most popular amongst consumers, but because they are the most likely to convert into paying customers. That's why the incest porn started. It's funny how that goes. This in turn gives porn customers, including teenagers, a highly distorted understanding of what other people want and expect from sex that some of them then act on. In my terms, they look through a distorting technological lens on an imaginary sexual public to understand what is normal and expected and what is not, and this shapes their interactions with others. Something like this explains the main consequences of social media for politics. Social media is always downstream for porn. Anyway, the collective perspective that emerges from social media, our understanding of what the public is and wants, are similarly shaped by algorithms that select on some aspects of the public while sidelining others. We tend to orient ourselves towards the understanding through a mixture of reflective beliefs, conformity with shibboleths, and revised understanding of coalitional politics. This isn't brainwashing. I don't think there's a such thing as brainwashing. People don't have to internalize this or that aspect of what social media presents to them, radically changing their beliefs and their sense of who they are. That sometimes happens, but it's it's likely far more rarely than we think. Excuse me. The more important change is to our beliefs about what other people think, our models of other minds. That's really important. We actually do a lot with that, which we perpetually update based on social observation. And if when I spend too much time on X Twitter, I have a much more jaundiced view of other minds than when I don't. I'm just going to put that out there. But when we observe is filtered through social media, our understanding of the coalitions we belong to and the coalitions we oppose, what we have in common, and what we disagree on, shift too. This leads to a different theory of what is wrong with social media than the usual one, although there is some overlap and a lot of research that has been done is still useful. If we think the big problem is disinformation, which I don't actually, we might persuade individuals that what is false is in fact true. We are likely to look on one set of remedies. If we think the problem is a malformed publics, then we are in much bigger trouble without a very obvious technical fixes. Any obvious solutions in the collective politics in a world where collective politics are only getting harder for a variety of reasons that I'm not seeing in this article yet, but I think is true. Over the last 2 weeks, Elon Musk has used Twitter X to derail a congressional budget resolution, writing Vox Populi Vox Dei after he won, to reshape the political debate in the United Kingdom around 2 decades-old scandal as to heightened tensions around Muslim immigrants, and to elevate the far-right ADF party as the only solution to Germany's problems. This morning, Mark Zuckerberg announced that Facebook is moving away from the censorship mistakes, removing restrictions on gender and immigration, and aligning with Trump to push back against foreign governments, i.e. the EU, that want American companies to censor more. Yeah, I actually do think I don't like the EU. I think the EU trying to force what it wants on other people is kind of interesting, given how much reactionary backlash it causes in Europe itself. Since the EU tries to be not particularly democratically accountable. These moves are reshaping politics so they center around issues that Musk cares about and that Zuckerberg cares about or sees as politically convenient to his interest. The resulting problem is not primarily problems of disinformation, although disinformation plays a role. They're the problems you get with large swaths of the public sphere are exclusively owned by wannabe God emperors. That is the problem with the commodification here. But I also think the EU answer, which is more censorship, which a lot of liberals like and have been praying about on Bluesky as a good thing, I don't think actually really helps either. It makes the public more paranoid against the good of bureaucracy, and rightly so, actually. Elon Musk owns Twitter X outright. Zuckerberg controls Meta through a system in which he is a CEO, chairman, and effective majority owner, all at the same time. What purports to be a collective phenomenon, the voice of the people, is actually in private hands. That is, a very great extent shaped by two extremely powerful individuals. But this was true before. I mean, this was also what Democrats were trying to utilize in 2020 with the censorship, is that these were not publicly accountable institutions, so you could censor in ways that you can't in the more traditional public sphere due to legal restrictions in the United States. Musk and Zuckerberg are different individuals with different relationships to their platforms. I expect the distortions they impose on the public will be quite different too. Specifically, Musk directly and repeatedly intervenes to ensure that everything around him, and through an algorithm that privileges his post and pile-on, through revocations of privileges to those who challenge him and other means, and he posts incessantly. The result is that Twitter X is a porn hub where everything is twisted around a particular kinks of a specific and visibly disturbed individual. Whatever Musk wants, as a voice of God, he may or may not become the voice of the people, but it is probably the people are going to end up talking about, whether they like it or not. Well, I mean, except that X is not the hugest platform in the world. This is what gives X Twitter its Philip K. Dick quality. It's like Dick's novel Uvik, in which the characters repeatedly find their world being pulled back into the mental patterns of a predatory teenager-turned existential vampire, Jory Miller. Zuckerberg's social media-shaped public does not turn around Zuckerberg in the same way, but even so, Zuckerberg is reshaping the algorithms so some aspects of the public, in particular a hostility to immigration to women and sexual minorities, will likely come to the fore while others will recede. We'll see. I'm not totally sure on that. It is a possibility, though. The extent to which this reflects his changing personal preferences as opposed to his willingness to strike a deal with Trump is of secondary importance. It isn't his personality so much as his interests that are likely to dominate. And again, none of this is brainwashing, but it is reshaping public debate, not just in the US, but in the UK, Europe, and other places too. But this was already happening with the private ownership of like news channels and shit. It's not new. It's not even unique to social media. Murdoch and Katzenberg were shaping public opinion this way too. And it's not just right wingers who do it. People censor the contours of politics, what is legitimate and what is out of bounds, and what others think and what are likely to do, and how they respond is visibly changing around us. Yeah, but I am going to say that the attempt to censor didn't work. Florida and Texas still happened. As far as like stuff around trans and LGBTQIA rights, right? This poses some immediate questions. Could democracy work if if a couple of highly atypical men exercise effective control over large swaths of the public sphere? I think the better question is, how did that happen? Because democracies enabled that to happen in the first place. And I'm not just talking about, through our entertainment choices. I'm talking about how we allowed Congress to, and government administrative state apparatuses to issue government contracts to a lot of these tech companies that allowed them to set up monopsony powers. How can the control be limited or counteracted, even in principle? What practical steps for reform are available in democracy shaped by people who you want to reform out of power? It poses more general questions, too. If you want to work towards a better system of democracy, which is both more stable and more actually responsive to what people need and want, how do you do this? It is easy, and I think personally I am biased, too, to see what is wrong with the public at Twitter and X. It's hard to think clearly about what a healthy public would look like, yet alone how to build one, because your prior models is just a media sphere of television, which was just as privately owned and just as manipulative. I don't have good answers to these questions, just questions. Still, I think there are questions we need to better understand the situation that is developing around us. Well, this is the problem with privatizing a lot of the public sphere. Adam Przeworski, the following describes the following Polish joke from the period of authoritarian rule. Adam Przeworski is one of my favorite former analytic Marxist. Favorite there, though, is still not a turn. Comrade Secretary delivers a speech on the dangers of American imperialism. Then all the comrades in the room express their opinions, all but Comrade Kowalski. It is late Friday night and everyone wants to go home, and yet Comrade Kowalski remains silent. Finally, Comrade Secretary turns to Comrade Kowalski. Comrade Kowalski, I delivered my speech. All the comrades express their opinions. You say nothing. Don't you have an opinion? To which Comrade Kowalski superficially replies, "Oh, comrade, the opinion. Oh, Comrade Secretary, the opinion I do have, but I do not know if I agree with it." I think thinking about the way framing and discourse works is important for understanding deliberative republics and whatnot. But I also think it shows a limit to the way we think about policy, because policy often isn't decided based on public discourse opinions. Because increasingly there is a removal of administration of the state from public sentiment, as everyone from Michael Sandel to internal critics of the EU have pointed out. And I think the pernicious way that the EU works around this, which is instead of ruled by market oligarchs, there's ruled by a bureaucratic oligarchy, which also prompts massive backlash in EU member states. I don't know how to get around that. All right, well, like and subscribe. You can check out more stuff over at Programmable Mutter by Henry Farrell. It's good stuff. And I think this does, despite the whole vaguely liberal problems that we see here, part of the issue is like the framing works more than just towards the right, and that's why there's not really always a good answer to it, because the other side realizes it can use similar manipulative framing if it wants to. Anyway, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and protect your peace. If you want more, there's more behind the Patreon, and take care.